Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We are very glad to welcome you today at our joint event of the New Europe Center and the European Union Institute for Security Studies. My name is Kateryna Zarembo, and I am very glad I'm a deputy director of the New Europe Center, and our today's topic is the influence of the third parties in Europe's east, in the east of Europe, in Eastern Europe. So it basically boils down to the question who and how influence the situation in Ukraine, the role of the countries to the west, neighboring countries, of Russian Federation, the United States, and the other major international actors. We have a study recently issued and published, and it's basically dedicated to the influence of four groups of state, including China, People's Republic of China, Turkey, Israel, and some other middle countries of the Middle East. So we welcome all our participants here in this hall and to everyone who follows us online. Let me now turn the floor over to Mr. Stanislav Sekrier, who is a senior analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. So my first question to you is, what are the neighboring countries' interests in Ukraine and towards Ukraine?
Speech in Ukrainian, but hopefully next time I will be able to do it. I would like first to thank an extremely skillful and excellent team of New Europe Center for putting this event together and for initiative to give us a chance to present the outcome of our research. Second thing, I cannot ignore what happened 5 years ago, just several meters from this building, and I would like to pay respect to everyone who was on Maidan and those who sacrificed their life for a better future of Ukraine. And then let me go back to the theme of our panel. I think I would rather focus on the third powers in the eastern neighborhood, and I'm sure our panelists have much deeper knowledge to develop what third powers are doing in Ukraine. And I would try to answer several questions. First one is why we have to pay attention to third powers and why we have to talk about third powers in the European eastern neighborhood. I would like also to explain the rise, what motivates, what drives the rise of third powers. I would like also to look what are the interests of third powers, what they want to achieve. And then finally, why Eastern Partnership countries sometimes are so happy about working and engaging with third powers as well. Well, first question is very simple. On the one hand, we spend too much time on focusing on Russia-EU competition interaction in the eastern neighborhood. It's an important story, and EU and Russia have economic levers to influence developments in the region, but it's not entire story. What we discovered during our research is that third powers' presence, politically, culturally, economically, diplomatically, increased significantly over the last 10 years. Yes, it's true, this rise was from a very low base, but this rise has already influence in the region, and we cannot ignore third powers in the eastern neighborhood anymore. Second, who are these third powers? So theoretically, this is a very flexible term. We excluded Russia, we excluded US, and we excluded European Union for the purpose of this exercise. And we could talk about Brazil or South Africa or even Indonesia. But in this case, we decided to include the closest neighbors of Eastern Partnership countries: Iran, Turkey, Persian Gulf, Israel, and we cannot neglect uninterrupted rise of China for the last 3 decades. So we included China in our exercise as well. What explains the rise of third powers in the Eastern neighborhood? There are three elements. First one, most of these countries underwent unprecedented period of economic growth and consolidation. Now they have more resources and more ambitious foreign policy than they had 15 years ago. Some of them who didn't undergo the rise in economic term, they still have important security interests. For instance, the case of Iran in the South Caucasus. They have to watch and prevent the escalation of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, to prevent the new stream of refugees in the country, but also they're worried about the growing presence of Israel in Azerbaijan or in Georgia. And they try to react and to counterbalance these developments. But then there is a third important element. The growing demand of Eastern Partnership countries to engage economically and in the security field these third powers. So basically their rise is facilitated by the growing acceptance of Eastern Partnership countries for these players to have a bigger role. And if I would think who combines those three elements, it would be Turkey. There is obviously economic performance over the last 15 years, lately less so, but over the last 15 years. There are security concerns for them in the South Caucasus, and there is a demand for Turkey, at least in case of Georgia, in case of Moldova, and other Eastern Partnership countries. Well, third question is what they want actually to achieve. Well, when we looked at third powers engagement in the region, we discovered the combination of mercantilist interests and security interests. Obviously, they would like to boost their exports, be it civilian or military. They as well would like to attract more tourists to sustain their touristic sector. They would like to export technologies. Look at the Huawei and Z expanding in Belarus, in Georgia, and in Azerbaijan. They as well would like to get access to technologies they don't have, and many of them are in the military field or space exploration as well. They want to get access to the resources. China having access to the copper in Georgia and in Armenia, or to potassium fertilizers in Belarus, or Israel and Turkey accessing oil and gas resources from Azerbaijan. Sometimes they play the game in order to avoid international sanctions. There were cases reported in the press about Iran trying to use banking systems in the South Caucasus republics in order to avoid international sanctions. Then there were cases when Turkey successfully used Belarus in order to avoid the trade embargo and access Russian market. So sometimes for them it's a good terrain to avoid sanctions. As well, they would like Eastern Partnership countries to be on board on important global issues, votes in the UN security or in the UN General Assembly, sorry. So there is a mixture of security and economic interests. Why Eastern Partnership countries are so enthusiastic? Well, it's a combination of Russian trade pressure, which encourages them to diversify trade, and Russian economic decline, which makes Russia less attractive in economic terms. Just look at the statistics, how the immigration patterns of workforce is slowly changing from Russia to Western countries, to Israel, and to US. But then, at the same time, China or Turkey does not ask them to join any kind of unions. They don't try to integrate them in something bigger. They don't try to constrain them. They offer a very flexible relationship, which is very attractive for Eastern Partnership countries. Well, what Eastern Partnership countries would like to get? Well, partially those who are pressured by Russia, they want to offset the effect of trade embargo. At some point, Moldova reached to sell more wine to China than to Russia. Georgia, the same case. Or the case of Belarus, who was pressured by Russia, and they tried to import oil from Iran in order to get a better deal later with Russia. They as well would like to attract investments, but it's not only about economic development. they think about investments as a security insurance. Let me give you an example of seaport Poti, which is owned by a Chinese company, 75%. So the assumption Georgians have is that if there will be a military action, probably Russia will not bomb the infrastructure built and owned by Chinese. So it's a combination of security and economic rationales. They as well would like to attract tourists. And if you go to South Caucasus, Iranian tourists in Yerevan, in Batumi, and in Tbilisi, it's a new normal. It's not an exception anymore. And in some cases, they surpass the number of Russian tourists. It's Armenia and Georgia. In some cases, for them, it's also about diplomatic support. Right after the Russian-Georgian war, for Georgian diplomacy, it was important to build international coalition to prevent recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And third powers were some targeted by these diplomatic services in order to get the support. So to get to the conclusions, what does it mean, basically? First of all, it's not anymore Russia-EU common neighborhood. This neighborhood becomes common for other third powers as well, because they are becoming closer. And Russia and EU facilitated the rise of third powers in the region, but in different ways. While Russia was pressuring these countries to diversify trade, EU, by signing DCFTAs, by pushing reforms, making these countries more competitive and attractive in terms of investment climate, they have a much better access now to third powers markets. Then, what this does mean is that Russian economic levers are less sharp than they were 10 years ago. It doesn't mean that Russia cannot make life of Eastern Partnership countries still difficult, but they have less means to do it, thanks to the presence of the third powers. Nevertheless, while Russian economic levers were diluted by third powers, they still possess important military capabilities about which we have to keep in mind. And in this case, third powers were not that helpful or still impact to build security sector in these countries is still marginal. Cooperation in military terms doesn't have that much effect helping them to sustain any kind of Russian military pressures. With this I will conclude and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, Станіславе. Дякую дуже, перш за все, напевно, за проблематизацію взагалі цих відносин, цих взаємин, регіональних взаємин. Дійсно, насправді, закликаю.
So I call on you, thank you, Stanislav, and I am calling on you, inviting you to get familiarized with this very interesting report, because in it you could find some aspects, some descriptions of some of the developments with regard to the interests of the third parties vis-à-vis Ukraine, some of which could be described as even cynical, and some cynical manifestations of these interests. So here we have analysis of Ukraine's policy vis-à-vis the third countries, and those third countries' policy vis-à-vis Ukraine and their interests towards Ukraine. At this point, I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Thomas Eder, who is the research associate at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, and ask him about his view on the near future prospects and interests of the People's Republic of China vis-à-vis Ukraine.
I'm going to try a little bit. So По-перше, я хотів би подякувати вам також, що я можу тут сьогодні теж.
Thank you for this opportunity given to me to be able to speak here today. I'm not yet able to speak or capable of speaking good Ukrainian, but I'm trying. I'm doing my best in order to learn it.
With this is to provide, as was just explained, a deeper look into what China does in the EU's eastern neighborhood, and I'm going to try and talk specifically about Ukraine, which is very clearly the most important country in the region for the Chinese government, the only country that China has a real and substantive interest in, and this is because of three things. So firstly, the military-industrial complex here in Ukraine, secondly, the Belt and Road Initiative, and thirdly, agriculture. Now, start with the military side of things. As probably all of you know, China got its first aircraft carrier from Ukraine. It's bought a substantial amount of aircraft engines from Ukrainian companies. There's been a lot of talk also about joint design, joint production possibilities. Chinese companies have even been interested in buying Ukrainian companies, but there's two problems with this. And the first one is import substitution on the Chinese side. So there's been a very energetic and active and strategic attempt by the Chinese side to replace imports, and there's already been quite a lot of success in replacing imports from Russia. So Chinese imports from Russia have been going down a lot since the beginning of this century. It's now only been a few big ticket items on the very top of the scale that Russia could still export to China. And one of the items China focuses on a lot in import substitution is also aircraft engines. So that's a problem for the Ukrainian side as well. Second problem is NATO concerns, NATO and EU concerns about Ukrainian exports to China in the military-industrial sector. So that is obviously something that the Ukrainian side will have to take into account when deliberating on these possibilities. Now, the second item I wanted to mention is the Belt and Road Initiative, and when many people hear about it, then they think about these transcontinental rail connections, and there obviously Ukraine has not been in a position to profit because of the blockade by Russia. But actually, this is not really what the Belt and Road Initiative is mainly about for China. What it's mainly about is benefits to the Chinese economy and foreign policy successes through international prestige. So on the second item, international prestige, Ukraine has already obliged because there is an MOU on jointly constructing the Belt and Road Initiative. Ukraine would also be willing, as you know, to participate in 16+1, the sub-regional forum of Central and Eastern European countries with China, but China cannot accept Ukraine into this round because that would raise ire in Moscow. On the economic side of things, what China wants to do with the Belt and Road Initiative is to open markets and to gain market share for its companies and build them into global champions. Now, here again, there's interest in Ukraine. There's already been an FTA concluded between China and Georgia. There's negotiations with Moldova, and China is very interested in pushing this further with Ukraine. The specific interest here is also to get free trade agreements with countries that already have free trade agreements with the European Union. So China could potentially, by enough value added within these countries, then be in a position to export to the European market. Now, a different question is whether this would be in Ukraine's interest to go for such an agreement. Another Chinese interest is getting contracts for its companies, and now we get to the concrete projects related to the BRI within Ukraine, and I'm gonna first talk a little bit about agriculture before I get to these, and you're gonna see why. In agriculture, and that's probably the most important and most long-term interest China has in Ukraine, because China has a lot of issues with food security, because its population is so enormous and it doesn't have enough arable land. A lot of land has already been destroyed also by industrial pollution. So it wants to diversify away from US imports because of the trade and bigger confrontation with the US, and Brazil, Argentina, but also Ukraine and others have profited in exporting corn, wheat, soybeans, and so forth to China. And this is exactly where then the most Chinese interest, focus, and investments and loans can be expected on Belt and Road related projects. So Chinese companies have already been active and have completed also some port projects. Dredging in Yuzhne and in Chornomorsk is under construction, and there's been more interest from the Chinese side. There's also been investment by KOVCO in grain silos and further infrastructure in Mykolaiv. And there's also a road, highway between Odessa and Mykolaiv that the Chinese side is interested in. So this is very much the focus on getting more Ukrainian agricultural products to ports and then out to the Chinese market. Aside from this, there's been a great interest from Chinese side also in exploring the enormous energy potential in Ukraine, specifically on the renewable side. So Chinese companies also currently building the largest solar power park in Ukraine, and another Chinese company has acquired Neptune Solar, Ukrainian company. So there's been movement there, and there's also been a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese CNNC and Energoatom on a potential nuclear cooperation. So these are the two big things on the BRI side. What hasn't worked and was probably been in the media a lot has been so far the train between Kiev and Boryspil Airport and the Kiev Metro. So there's been a lot of delays there. I would say Chinese interest is more with these two other dimensions I've laid out. And I think I'm going to leave it at this for now, and I would gladly in the discussion then talk also about the German perspective and about the European EU perspective on China and Ukraine, concerns, but also cooperation potential. Thank you.
Дякую дуже. Дякую дуже, Томасе.
Thank you, Thomas. The issue of how Germany and the other EU countries view Chinese interests in this region, and I would like to use this opportunity and say that as February the 21st was proclaimed by the government of Ukraine the Day of Ukrainian Language, I wanted to thank Thomas for his speaking Ukrainian language. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Sergiy Korsunsky, who is the director of the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine, who is ambassador of Plenipotentiary, extraordinary plenipotentiary, and let us hear from you the assessment of Ukraine's relations with the neighboring countries, especially in the Middle East and Central East. We have heard about the relations between Ukraine and China, and now your views on the relations between Ukraine and neighboring countries in the Middle East. I would like to start by saying that this research and this report are very timely because I'm sure that the next president of Ukraine will have to deal with foreign policy issues And it's not only because of domestic politics dictate this, but also the international situation. Chinese influence, for example, is a good point that illustrates the changing international environment for Ukraine. And I would like to say that if we look at these changing balances of power and relationships, even in Europe, we need to take into account all these changes. When, for example, France called his revoked temporarily called on his ambassador from Rome, and so on and so forth. When we look at the neighborhood of Ukraine, we can see such countries as Romania, Turkey, the other countries. Again, China could not and should not be ignored. I would like to say, this is my personal view, that we do not pay enough attention to development of the ties, especially economic ties, with the People's Republic of China. China is unstoppable in its development, and when they have the GDP growth rate in excess of 6 percentage points, they already think that it's something that it's somehow signifies the weakening of their economic development. If you compare it, though, to the economic development of the other countries, you could see that it's a tremendous growth rate. China is now constructing the new 5G IT, well, basically mobile phone communication networks. Whatever the other countries say about Huawei and some the other Chinese companies, we are witnessing China's tremendous technological leap forward, probably unparalleled and unmatched by the other countries, any other country. So I think that we should pay more attention to, the development of peaceful relations. Speaking about potential of our relations, the potential of our relations with China, we certainly can, and it was already pointed out, can highlight the potential of agricultural potential of Ukraine and the potential of other economic sectors of Ukraine. We should adopt systemic view, though, of all these foreign policy developments, because Ukraine cannot afford not to take into account the point of view of the United States, of the European Union. But as we can see, the accusations, recent accusations of these countries against China, they are mostly, politically motivated, and the source of these concerns that they put forward vis-à-vis China, the sources are mainly the think tanks in these same countries, Western countries. I cannot but mention Turkey. We certainly remember the events of 2016, and we should bear in mind the effects of those events. But we should, for example, see the participation of Turkey in the Plenipotentiary pipeline project, and for example, the plans for construction of a nuclear power plant in Turkey. And if Turkey constructs that nuclear power plant, it changes radically its status. Turkey becomes a nuclear power. again, what I have heard of are the plans of Turkey to buy from the Russian Federation the new aircraft defense systems, S-400, and we certainly appreciate Turkey's position vis-à-vis the Crimean Peninsula and vis-à-vis the Crimean Tatars. We continue to be engaged in the dialogue with Turkey, but we cannot ignore the fact that Turkey is on the third place among the, for example, telephone contacts between the top leaders of the countries. The leader of the Russian Federation, Mr. Putin, with the foreign leaders. Turkish leadership is on the third place after Germany and France and Germany. So we, I think, should clearly acknowledge the fact that romantic relations of Ukraine with its neighbors and any other third countries is over. Ukraine should become more pragmatic and should set clear foreign policy priorities, which is done by any other country. As you know, any country in the world has its own foreign policy priorities. So, thank you for your attention, and I'd be ready to answer any questions. Thank you. Certainly, all the countries mentioned in our research, they have their priorities, and if we speak about countries of the Middle East, certainly they all have their priorities. And in terms of pragmatic approaches, pragmatism is probably a nickname of the Israeli foreign policy. Israel is very active in protecting its interests. So the floor is yours now, Mr. Igor. What's your assessment of the foreign policy interests of the countries, especially to the south and east of Ukraine, vis-à-vis our country? Well, thank you first for this opportunity to be here, and I'd say that your report is very interesting and valuable in terms of describing these foreign policy developments in the other countries. For example, the relationship between Ukraine and the Middle Eastern countries could be portrayed by, for example, the idea that one of the reasons of the Arab Spring manifestation of that revolution in Egypt was the fact that the harvest in Ukraine, grain harvest in Ukraine in 2010 was quite poor, and the prices grew in the world market, and that provoked basically the outbreak of dissatisfaction of the Egyptians with their government. This is just an illustration of these interconnections between Ukraine and many other countries. If we speak specifically about Ukraine's economic cooperation with Middle Eastern countries, first of all, the positive fact for Ukraine is that we have a positive trade balance with all these countries. In terms of our relations with Israel, as you know, recently the free trade area agreement was signed with China, and as we clearly understand now, Ukraine is turning into one of the key suppliers of agricultural produce into the countries of the Middle East. Sorry. And it was not by chance that I referred to that example of Egypt it's an illustration of the fact that even a domestic political situation of some countries of the Middle East could be affected by different developments in Ukraine's economy. And I think we can sometimes it's good when we can remind some of our partners about whom their economies depend on. Since the start of the confrontation in the east of Ukraine, the economic developments in Ukraine have changed. Ukraine's economic growth was affected, and Ukraine's traditional partners, commercial partners like, for example, Egypt, which remains the third largest importer of grain from Ukraine. Our trade, agricultural trade with Egypt and the other Middle Eastern countries were affected negatively by by that confrontation. So we can say that this negative trend continued until 2016, and since 2016 we have witnessed the new developments in our relations vis-à-vis Middle Eastern countries, especially Arab countries. We can say that since 2016 up to now, the Gulf nations have been gaining, more influence and strength, and I dare say that the center of political influence in the Arab world has shifted to the Gulf. In the rate, so to say, or grade of activity, economic activity in the commerce between the countries of Eastern Europe and Middle Eastern countries, we can say that probably Belarus has overtaken Ukraine as a trade partner and as a country that invests, that draws and attracts Arab investments. Although both Turkey and the Arab countries and the Gulf countries specifically, when they come to Ukraine, they see for themselves the large potential of Ukraine's economy, and it goes without saying that the exports of agricultural produce into all these countries, at least Arab countries, continues to be an important venue for trade in agricultural produce. I can tell you that about 30% of apples, for example, that Turkey buys from abroad is bought from Ukraine. And in the United Arab Emirates, the Ukrainian apples, the apples from Ukraine, are the most expensive. So you could see that there are enormous prospects for some items of Ukrainian exports, especially agricultural exports, to the other countries. Speaking about the high-precision weaponry trade, if we speak about the military industrial cooperation or trade relations. For example, the issue of selling the Stugna system, which is the precision weapon, precision strike system, its sales to some Arab countries was considered by, or is being considered by the Ukrainian government. And we can see that politically speaking, some of the majority of the countries, Arab countries, usually abstain from from supporting politically the Russian Federation in the international organizations, this confrontation with the pro-Russian forces in the east of Ukraine are considered. Although some of the Gulf countries, they traditionally vote in support of Ukraine. And Israel, from the point of view of our relations with Israel, I'd say that they are balanced. One of the reasons is that around 500,000 people in Israel, Israeli citizens, came there from Ukraine. And by the way, when I mentioned the Arab countries, I forgot to mention Ukrainian emigres there. I would say that at certain points in time, good relations between Ukraine and some Arab countries was practically the result of the activities of the Ukrainian citizens in those countries, rather than some active trade between Ukraine and those countries. And if we speak about the neighboring countries with whom we have common border, like Turkey, for example, we can speak about some growth in the inflow of tourists into Ukraine. But Israel is a very pragmatic country. Israel votes as its interest dictate, and sometimes they ignored the votes on some issues related to Ukraine in some international organizations. But recently the situation has changed so that Israel has supported supported Ukraine on some of the issues, and we are trying to support Israel on the issues that are interesting to Israel. Certainly we should understand that Ukraine is not as interesting to Israel as the Russian Federation. And we can say that Russia's presence in Syria is one aspect. The other aspect is good relations between Russia and Iran, and Israel cannot neutralize the positive nature of these relations. But we should also bear in mind, when we speak about economic or trade relations between Israel and the Russian Federation, we can say that as compared to if we compare it to the trade of Israel with all the countries of the EU, we can say that the Israel-EU trade amounts to only 40% of the Israel-Russian Federation trade. Another aspect for the development of trade relations, we can say that there are some promising areas of technological exchanges or trade in technologies between Israel and Ukraine. For example, Israelis are well known for their innovations in agriculture, and some of their technologies could be interesting to the agricultural sector of Ukraine. So we have seen some interesting developments and some aspects of Ukraine's influence in the other countries. Certainly we do not overestimate them, but still they exist. Now the questions. My question is addressed to Mr. Korsunsky.
I have a question about Turkey. So these relations are underestimated. You should remember about Mr. Umerov, who was exchanged, and we know that there is NATO base, and what we will do in order to remain in good relations with Turkey, and what NATO will do in order to influence Turkey, because they have the base, military base there, Crimean Tatars, and what can we do in order to prevent a big influence of Russia on Turkey? One more question.
Center of International Studies in Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine, and my question is to Thomas Eder. I would like to ask about EU-China relationships. What is the likelihood that they would establish a free trade agreement? Because there are long talks, and as far as I understand, there is no complicated to find agreement between them in trade issues. But the question is about investment agreement. It is the first point, and the second point is about non-economic relations between EU and China, because China promotes the slogan that other countries should respect their political system, and as far as I understand, European Union countries is not ready maybe to accept this position of China. So what is the solution for this misunderstanding? Or thank you.
Так, дякуємо.
Thank you for your question. Please, Sergiy. Thank you. When we are speaking about Turkey, we should clearly understand, we should clarify everything, as they say in English. And the figures about Crimean Tatar population, you say that there are 7 million. So this figure constantly increases. No one knows this. There are no Crimean Tatars, or they are all Turkish people. Maybe 2 or 3 million are from Crimea, and now they live in Turkey. They live in some regions in large numbers, and these Turks who are from Crimea, there is kinship, and they have connections that are really important, and these relations will be supported. We have wonderful cooperation in this area with Turkey. We have constant visits. Before the war, there were close relations, and Turkey helped Crimean Tatars, and they worked through TIKA agency, and after the war, the majority of the project stopped, but Turkey does not recognize the annexation of Crimea, this is for sure. About NATO. This is NATO country. This is not only a base, this is one of the most important members of NATO. There are no grounds, and no matter what happened there, and no matter what relations Turkey has with Russia, Turkey will understand the importance of NATO. And now the matter is European Union. Now the negotiations are freezed, and Turkey says that this is about EU, and EU says that Turkey does not implement some obligations, and they constantly speak about accession, and France is absolutely against the participation of the membership of Turkey. And some points of negotiations are closed, and I do not want to repeat those accusations, but this is not our business. We know that Turkey is a really important partner for Ukraine. It controls Bosphorus, and because Azov, that is practically closed by Russia Rus, and this is really bad. And the Black Sea is faces really difficult situation, and our ports are in difficult situation. And this is our trade, this is our security. That's why Turkey should not interfere and should not interfere in some military actions, because then Bosphorus will be closed. They should have positive neutrality, and Turkey it wants to develop economic relations, and I held 5 rounds of negotiations, and there is a serious issue. We are agricultural nation, big agricultural nation, and we grow as agricultural nation, and Turkey is afraid to open its market for us, because there are no apples for 5 hryvnias in Turkey. And if you see sunflower field in Turkey, if they have 200 plants, this is a big field. But if you look at our fields in Odessa, you can see that these fields are really big, and they try to preserve their sector, and for them this is their people. These are their people. They want to help them, and you know that their soil is not very good, and yes, there are some problems, but I would like to say that I am concerned that Turkey and Russia now have closer relations. This is official information, and there is increase in the number of tourists from Ukraine and from Russia, and our trade increases, but Russia provides billions for tenders, and you know that Turkey is a young country. They have 84 million people, and there are a lot of young people under the age of 29, so we should take this into account. And at the same time, we should find our own ways, our own agenda with a new Turkey that appeared after reform, after President Erdogan came to power, and the change of Atatürk Republic, and with the special powers of the president now, we should rethink our position concerning Turkey, and I have no doubt about it. Thank you. Mr. Thomas Eder.
Thank you. So first, on the economic side of things, well, an FTA with China is not on the agenda, and it's not going to be for quite a while. An investment agreement is, as you said, it's the so-called comprehensive agreement on investment. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, optimism when Donald Trump was elected, because the European side thought, well, now they're going to get nowhere with the US, and they're going to be very eager to make compromises and get to an agreement with us. Well, it doesn't look like it. So negotiations have still been very difficult, and what the European side would like to see is more reciprocity, in the sense of Chinese companies can invest in many, many European sectors that European companies cannot in China. And there's just not been very much movement on the Chinese side, and there could still be success in the upcoming 2 or 3 years, but it's not going to be easy. On the non-economic relations, I guess what is often meant when the question comes up is how much acceptance do you show to different political regimes? Then I guess the question is, do you want to exclude criticism? And I think oftentimes the Chinese side doesn't like criticism, but then again, I think friends should be open and honest with each other, what they think. And the Chinese side is also part of the UN Human Rights Council. It has accepted submitting reports, as EU member states have accepted to do from their side. Then other states can make comments, and China does make comments on the European states' reports. And they can be critical, and that is well and fine. And the European side will continue to comment if it thinks that Chinese citizens detained outside the criminal law procedure without access to a lawyer and without any due process is something that it would recommend handling differently. And China has its views and gives recommendations to the European states how they should handle differently, how they process these things. And I think that's just fine.
Дякую дуже. Так, бачила ще були запитання. Так, прошу, будь ласка, пані.
Yes, please, Evgenia. Good afternoon, Evgenia Gabor, Deputy Head of Diplomatic Academy. I have a question, comprehensive conceptual question, whether the Eastern Partnership countries, including Ukraine, whether these countries are ready for the involvement of these third powers. Yes, this is the step ahead, and Stanislav told us about it. These countries were seen as close neighbors for Russian Federation or European neighbors, and the reference points outside these countries and the involvement of third powers and China and Chinese investment and Israel investment. This is diversification, and this is the way to independence from some powers. So do we have enough force to protect our interests in cooperation with these partners who have more experience, who are more powerful? And when we are speaking about signing of free trade agreements with Israel, Turkey, and other nations, whether this is always good, and whether the conditions are good for Ukraine, or maybe we may also ask who benefit more from these agreements, we or those third powers. And do we have strategic view in order to first set these national priorities and then protect them? And also to our European colleagues. So how this is viewed in the European capitals, if these countries, if they do something else, if they protect their interests and form their foreign agenda, or are there risks? Because there can be differences in key issues concerning Iran, China, and maybe we should coordinate these issues with the EU, and these questions are really difficult. So first we will start with our colleagues, and then we will transfer to our foreign colleagues. It is difficult to say whether we have forces to do this. We should start. We should start these relations. We should show that we have our own views, Ukrainian view. And after the Revolution of Dignity, we face such a situation. There is a factor that influences really a lot, and we should take into account the position of the United States, because this is our main partner concerning weapons and political support. That's why we should and obliged to take its position into account. And also we should take into account the position of the European Union and deep and comprehensive trade agreement and visa-free regime. All those things are really important for society, for economy. And from the other side, I believe that Ukraine should grow up in this issue. And yes, EU is our main trade partner as a group. And we increased exports significantly. And but we increased import 3 times. And if we continue, this won't be a sustainable economy. It cannot be supported in such a form. The right policy. So, if we buy something, we should also contribute to add value, and this will be successful policy. We should correct our policy, we see the results, and we should do proper steps. About China, whether we like it or not, but we will cooperate with China because they do not ask anything, they just come and do things. And that's why we should understand our interests, and also we should cooperate with China. Yes, EU and China, they have many problems among them, and also there is a screening, the instruction in the EU for trading with China, and some requests are rejected because there are some threats. There are some threats that they just will take this technology for their own use. And you know that Germany, they cooperate with China greatly, and also 16+1 and other forms of cooperation work. And they work with Serbia, Hungary, Romania. So we cannot ignore this country. We should clearly understand this. We cannot hide any longer behind our problems. We cannot just say we have war with Russia, don't touch us. We should find the ways. Where are our interests and how we can use foreign political situation. And you understand that Belt and Road Initiative, one of the routes goes near Caspian Sea, and Abkhazia and Ossetia and Transnistria, Donbas and Crimea, everything is marked. And they look at this and they don't like this, and they want to have these issues lifted. But maybe our views on the resolution of the situation differ, and here we need to have fine policy how to reach our interests, and we should also respect the interests of the United States and use opportunities of cooperation that exist with the third countries in order to implement our goals. Thank you, Igor. Is Ukraine ready for this work? When we are speaking about Ukrainian perception, how to work in the East, we usually speak about the vector from Ukraine to the Middle East. This is economic vector, and some time ago there was a strategy of making foreign policy commercial, less policy, more trade. Whether we are ready to have this vector reversed, and when we are speaking about China and other countries, security issues, they prevail. We do not have investment, and the Chinese, they also are not ready to seriously invest here, and Arab nations, Persian Gulf nations, there are many talks, and you know that security situation prevents investment. And we would get these investments if the situation was different. But Whether this vector be efficient in the nearest future, I'm not sure about it. So you've mentioned security component, but if, for example, we had more investment in Azov Sea, in the Black Sea, investment from China, maybe it would minimize risks from Russia, maybe, but we do not have them. And all talks about this investment, they were started before the war, and they were opposed in Ukraine. And you remember the situation about talks about China investment in the port in the Black Sea region and Chernomorsk, and there were good prospects. So there are many things. And if we are speaking about the situation, we may say that Ukrainians are not ready to properly cooperate, and the partners also are not ready for proper cooperation. They want just to wait some time. So there is a pause in investment, and the situation is now protracted and delayed. Thank you.
I would like to add from myself that when we, my colleagues and I, in the Center New Europe were making this research, we tried to analyze what they call the hybrid threats. And I'd say that these hybrid threats now, well, the Chinese, or rather their relations with China were considered by some as one of those hybrid threats. What's your view of that?
They contribute to the Eastern Partnership countries' economic resilience, in line with the European Neighborhood Policy Review conducted in 2013. So from your perspective, the more these countries trade with the outside world according to transparent rules, the better for you. And partially, DCFTAs were designed not only to increase the access to European market, but to other markets as well. On the other hand, there is a problem because third powers undermine European normative power. For instance, one research in Georgia conducted in terms of analyzing the FDI coming from third powers and from EU, we've discovered that FDI from third powers often come as a part of shadow corrupt deals. They are not at the origin, but they fuel corruption. Well, there were several cases when countries were pressured to violate or to break some democratic rules and norms. There was a pressure to close down some educational institutions which in these countries are performing well and provide high educational standards. For instance, in Moldova, Turkish lyceums were among the best, but there was pressure to close them down. And then it undermines the conditionality of European Union. European Union provides assistance with certain conditions. And on the side of Georgia, on the side of Belarus or Azerbaijan, we've seen a systematic effort to engage third powers in order to avoid any kind of democratic conditionalities which EU tries to promote in these countries. So it's bad and good, and it will depend on EU how will EU navigate it in the next decade, and the third powers' influence will increase. And if I may, one word, if Eastern Partnership countries, not only Ukraine, are ready to deal with third powers. So certainly for them, a Russian threat is more urgent than developments which third powers negatively can influence in 10 years down the road. That's why in some cases they don't think about effects. They want to address the immediate threat. On the other hand, I've seen in many cases when Eastern Partnership countries were treating very carefully, for instance, China proposals of loans. There was intention to take loans to develop road infrastructure in Moldova, but then we discovered that the rates are too high and there will be a macro financial problems if they will go for Chinese loans. So I think countries are discovering third powers as well, and what are the dangerous elements. They try to avoid one, and profit maximally from this kind of relationship. And just third powers are doing the same. They see the mistakes Russia commits in the Eastern neighborhood, and they're happy to maintain relationship with Russia, not to challenge it directly, but then have good business deals with Eastern Partnership countries. And I think the example of China having this deep strategic partnership with Russia and at the same time looking for opportunities to engage with military defense cooperation in Ukraine to profit of disruption of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia is a very good example how cynical third powers can be.
Thank you. Thomas?
So I very much agree. It's good and bad. I think overall, China's presence in the region can be a positive for the EU as well, if it's handled well by all sides. I think you described very well some concerns that are out there. I mean, if we widen the lens a bit and look at what BRI projects typically look like, then there's the concern that it's not always private companies and it's not always investment, but it's rather loans. Then when we look at an example like Montenegro, that for the size of the relevant economies, host state economies, which is very big, and sometimes are at commercial rates or higher, sometimes are lower. But at any rate, even if it's concessionary interest rates, can be difficult to imagine how these will not affect financial stability. So for Montenegro, the IMF has then also issued a warning that just the loan for one highway project would increase the debt to GDP ratio by 20%. And that is just questionable how the economic benefits can really be enough to then warrant such a loan. And then another concern that comes in with these projects is that it's not a coincidence that they are usually within laxer regulatory environments, no matter where you look on the globe. Not in stricter ones, because the way China likes to have these things play out is to benefit its economy, as I said, and that is easier if the projects automatically go to Chinese companies and there's no open tender where companies from every country can compete, but where they just automatically go to a Chinese company, and then the Chinese company can contract Chinese suppliers, can hire Chinese citizens, and then can try to maximize the impact for the Chinese economy. So that was a problem also with the Budapest-Belgrade railway project. Debt was also a problem there because also Hungary had a constitutional amendment on stopping further debt increases. And I think the EU interest there is really for, as Stanislav said, resilience in countries in the EU's neighborhood, and for them to, yes, diversify and to get good deals. So the broader the stance and the more resilient these countries are, then I think the better the deals that these countries will also get from China. And if there can be Chinese-led projects where there's also a good financial deal for China, that's just perfect for the Brussels and Berlin view as well.
Дуже дякую. Так, будь ласка, прошу.
От я дуже радий, що це питання.
I'm very glad that you touched upon this issue, because when I am following some critique with regards to China from some other countries, I would like to express opposing view. For example, Deutsche Bank, for example, recently negotiated the loan for the purchase of some compressor stations for the pipelines, natural gas pipelines. You can easily guess that those loans were supposed to be spent on purchasing equipment from the companies, somehow related to Germany. Nobody makes the countries to take loans from China under the conditions that are bad. But when the European Union imposed a number of conditions on Greek economy and socio-economic system of the country, China simply bought for $18 billion, with no conditions, bought for $18 billion all the infrastructure of the Piraeus seaport in Greece. It happens quite often when some countries and international financial institutions try to impose certain conditions. Then the Chinese side, for example, offer credit resources, offer loans with no political frills, so to say, attached. And the Chinese usually, both in China and even in the poorest countries of Asia, like Afghanistan, in many other remote and poor regions of the world, they do construction projects. And I'm wondering why the European Union cannot see the simple reality that the poor countries, especially those that underwent economic crisis, they do not have any other ways of getting any funds except for borrowing. And if we see that a country is under these conditions, it's pretty clear that China simply provides loans, being with no conditions, remaining the only practically source for cheap money and funds. I'm not going to advocate China. I'm not in any way protecting their interests, but I'm just stating the realities, the way things are. And we are aware of the fact that overall the external debt of the countries and the sovereign debts all over the world, of many countries all over the world, is growing. I think the overall, the total amount is assessed at 250 trillion or something like that, $1 trillion. And during the World Economic Forum, some experts said that came to the conclusion, and it was stated during the World Economic Forum events, that many of those loans were misused. They were not used, these loans were taken, but not used for economic development, infrastructural development, and some of the other serious things, but rather spent for consumer goods and things like that. Ladies and gentlemen, we are to close in 3 minutes. So the last question. Well, mine is rather a remark than a question. We have heard from Mr. Korsunsky that China usually goes where there is some power vacuum or resources vacuum, financial resources specifically. But I can quote or refer all of us to the example of Georgia. And Georgia, confronting some challenges, economic and other challenges, and the security challenges, is trying to find its own way of tackling these challenges, resolving. For example, to illustrate the validity of your remark, Mr. Korsunsky, I recently read in one of the newspapers that Georgia is introducing Chinese language as the second foreign language to be studied in their comprehensive schools and in the secondary education system in general. Thank you, dear experts, for your comments, for your observations, and we will really appreciate it if the journalists, if the media representatives who are here today with us would comment and would present our today's event in